talk is called accelerated learning. From Eric's talk last night, it could also be called using DDD's principles and patterns as applied philosophy for organizational change. So a big part of what we're trying to do over the last year at our org is figure out a way to bring everybody along for the ride while going through a ton of change. And while trying to help drive that from tools, obviously that's silly, but the goal was to, how do we take those principles, apply them to everything we're doing, drive organizational change, and take everyone along for the ride. So the goal then is, how do we create this learning organization with those principles? So how do we allow an organization to focus on its core domain? How do we allow people to work together with your business partner? How do we allow people to start to see and navigate their context so we can create a systems view of how everything works together? And in that process, the three things we came up with that were our constant roadblockers were the organizational alignment, the mindset of our team members and our business partners, and how do we get them doing things the same way, as well as practice. So doing DDD is hard. Getting people to understand the principles while also navigating a ton of change is harder. So what we're going to talk about today then is the properties of the organizational alignment. Does it help you or hinder you? We're going to talk about a deliberate practice, the tools we put in place to get there, as well as the proper mindset. So being product-centric, and then principles of DevOps, but very limited to that. There's plenty of other topics out there on that. But first, I need to paint the picture of our context. So I work for a large retailer. I work for the credit division of a large retailer. So it is about a 40-year-old business, and it's financial services and retail. As you can imagine, as most other mid-size enterprises do financial services, there's a ton of legacy systems. So we have systems that are about 20 years old. We have systems that are brand new. The vast majority of the things we're working on are 10 to 13 years old. And a few years ago, we realized, hey, our core domain is retail. So let's see, why are we also running this financial services? So we also looked at, as the credit card portfolio, we had about $2 billion worth of receivables and assets, which is a huge burden on, potentially a huge burden on a retail organization in 2016. So that time, we decided to partner with a larger bank who we could offload that debt to. They could help us grow the portfolio. We can make money for them. They can help us with their platforms and systems, and we can move forward. So when we started doing that, we started looking at the systems that we might want to migrate. So we have internal systems, very old. We would like to move to their platform. We looked at their domain. Our domain specifically had been built around financial services for a retail organization. Their systems had all been built around financial services for the sake of financial services. And as we started to investigate, the domains didn't line up at all, and it was very difficult to start moving towards their platforms. So in the end, we decided that this wasn't the best thing right now. In the meantime, though, another year and a half had passed. So we started to look at where we were and the decision not to go forward. So we had systems that were already old, needed repairing, and we had systems that we had been working on, brand new systems. We had drawn a line in the sand, new systems going forward, been managing integration with those. But now we arrived at a place where we had brand new systems, as most people can probably attest to. From a project mindset, we would start off with a new system, you'd go build it, then you'd move on to your next project, and then you would pick up where they left off, make some improvements, but you never get to go back and make the improvements in that system. So now you've got two of the same thing. And then you would go out and build a third one off of the good things they learned, but never did you get to go back and fix their system. So now, not only did we have a ton of systems legacy in the past, we've now also created 3 different ways of doing the same thing, 3 different ways of interpreting domain, 3 different ways possibly of infrastructure. So 3 different places that have different bugs to monitor the availability, the infrastructure, along with the domain concerns. And that's where the story starts. So 12 months ago, our systems, we're working on over 60 applications, about 90 people, 9 programming languages in production, so 1 language per 10 people, 4 platforms, 10 different ways of saving data, and about 6 different ways of actually communicating between them. Not terribly surprising for most mid-sized enterprises. We'll look at alignment, though. So our alignment at the time And our business side, the business side had over the time taken all of the tools that were around talking and servicing directly with customers. So they had the phone system, they have the desktop agents when you call into the call center, and how do you navigate the customer's account from that system, warehousing analytics, how do they answer questions for the business, things they cared about. On the tech side, over on the other side of the wall, we had things around making sure people could get new accounts. We have digital applications, arbitrary stuff, the mainframe system that took all the third-party data in and passed it along to a warehouse, as well as the system that handles online card management. So all of these things, all of the experiences to service a customer, split across the organization, don't line up, lots of issues. So everyone's heard of Conway's Law, I'm assuming at this point. It's pretty old hat. Point was, the first thing we ran into, we can't make forward, people can't see the context, can't see the systems. So our first thing we do is reorg, right? So we go the old adage that if culture is eating strategy for breakfast, then our organizational structure is destroying our ability to get any architectural improvements done. So we just move people over. Did that solve any problems? Of course not. So first thing we do, we bring everybody back in at least under one organization so we can leverage that. So we start to bring people in from other teams, start to see what they're learning, how they interact, start to share knowledge across the applications themselves. But the teams are all still isolated in applications. Next thing we do, we say, okay, now that we understand the applications a little better, let's start mapping out our experiences and align our organization to the actual value streams that the company provides. So our strategic pillars that our business partners care about, we line up along those ways. So we create these squads where we focus on how do people become a new card member, how do they get their line of credit. We create a different set of people that handle experiences around maximizing your experience with your card. So things like campaigns, how do you, if you forget your card at home, and you go to the store and you actually want to use your card to shop, things along those lines. Then we have a pod around managing your account. So if you want to omni-channel experience for getting support. So if we want to be customer obsessed, we want to make sure that you as a cardholder and as a customer are always taken care of. How do we make sure that those experiences are lined up very tightly? And then Protect My Credit is all around loss mitigation and fraud detection, that kind of stuff. If you lose your job, we want to make sure that, yes, you owe us money, but you might need to buy a new suit to go to your next interview. So how do we make sure that you don't damage your credit, but make sure that we can have a good experience? There's asterisks around core platform and data processing. The fact was this was a huge warehouse, and as most warehouses built in late 90s, it's a very canonical data structure. Everything must go in there. It served operational purposes as well as analytics, and there's no clear borders between them. It's just a big mess that we're trying to unwind, and they exist in the same space as core platform as a services. So, and of course, a core platform, I draw it thin on purpose to always remind me to say that, yes, we want to converge on best practices and services, but we also need to make sure these teams have some autonomy, but then always walking that line between how do we make sure that we're going forward together, but that you don't have too many dependencies on the core, and you have some autonomy maintained. Digging one level deeper, create a true cross-functional teams. So we've got engineering, TPMs, product management, everything on the one team. But this is where me as a leader in the organization has a problem. We're all here, but we've just taken people who over the last up to 20 years have been maybe building line of business CRUD apps on, say, ASP.NET web forms, and now we've put them into a pod to support all the services, and some of our new teams are maybe supporting asynchronous communication for new accounts, and they never worked on that technology. So we've basically taken their organization and their safety, place of safety, thrown everything to the wind. They need to not only know new business, but they need to understand how to work in that system. They need to understand how to do the new technology, how to work with the new technology and tools to be successful. So my goal throughout all of this is to work on psychological safety of my team members so that they feel like they're supported and they can move forward together. And that's the whole point of the next part of this talk. It's about how do we bring everybody along together so that no one feels left out? How do we make sure that they're learning what they need to do? How to make sure that they're paying attention to the patterns and principles that help us succeed? So mindset, the mindset of our partners, of our team members, and where they're at from a place of safety. So we spent some time to make sure that teams understood why we did this work from project to product. Again, I said I won't go into too much detail there. The big piece I already mentioned, which is when you're going forth in a project mindset, you're funded for a set of features, a project, and then it goes away, you start the next thing. You never go back and fix it. We all say, oh, when we're done, we'll go back and change X. Of course, it never happens. The DevOps piece, not from a, oh, hey, buzzword DevOps, hey, you're now a DevOps engineer. It's more, we were just simply talking about how do we help them get flow of work in there and then leverage quick feedback loops so we can help deliver. And then also because as we shifted to the product mindset, we as a standard financial enterprise type system, IT is just a service provider for delivery. So we're not part of ideation. We're not part of figuring things out. We're always looked at as, we've already made all the hard decisions, you just go build this. So in pulling forward to product, we wanted to make sure that our engineers are used for their problem solving skills and pulled forward all the way to true discovery. So part of that is how do they use tools? How do we doing standard product development? Not necessarily writing the code, but going through and doing context mapping, understanding the problem space, helping solve those problems. And then learning is a skill. This was never an intention. This was just us learning over the last year how easy it is for people to get comfortable in their own space. And when you don't actively go seek to learn new things, how you can lose the muscle of, oh, yes, I can go Google this, but then what do I do next? So what we uncovered the whole time is how do I leverage tools and just general problem solving skills to help make sure that we are coming back at relearning how to learn. So I'll repeat again, a disclaimer. Trying to change team behavior using technology without organizational support is a waste of time. No one is here suggesting that we are going to say, oh, use this tool, it's a silver bullet, making sure that organizational support is there. So as we started to roll these things out, as we started to play, running workshops, we started to hear some patterns of thinking that we thought were somewhat negative and or not necessarily negative, but patterns of thinking that were emerging that we wanted to tackle through solving some of these things. So some of the things we were hearing was, great, we just had this conversation and we've talked through the system, but we have no idea how big this feature is. We don't really understand it yet. We don't even know how to give you any kind of idea what it is. Or, and we just spent 2 weeks on the spikes. Why did we even start it? We don't even know what we were trying to accomplish. Trying to try out new technologies and we get lost. Everyone's doing something completely different and we can't agree, we can't converge on ideas. I did it this way for 20 years. Oh, I did it this way for 10 and I'm better. And how do we start to reduce that conflict and all of that understanding? So, what we're trying to get and what we've been working on is that, yes, number of applications doesn't matter. We still have 90 people. We still have 60 applications. We still want to get to one platform instead of 4. We want to, we can't get down to one programming language because that's silly these days, but a much more friendly, coherent set of things, as well as unified messaging and then practical persistence. No one's going to say, use Dynamo for everything. We have different needs for polyglot persistence. Let's use it, but let's be thoughtful. So, back to the point was how do we provide psychological safety to our team members? How do we help them start learning? Well, how do we track that they're learning? How do we keep that mindset of experimentation and measuring of what people are doing? And how do we formalize it so that it can become deliberate practice? We had at one point, we were trying to come up with things to measure, and in places, every time you can come up with some behavior you want to see change, you can find a measurement, but we started defaulting to a silly mean time to validated learning, just as a joke to figure out, I have no idea how to measure this, but I'm just going to write down start of the spike, end of the spike. Roughly translates, of course, to just the cycle time for that one particular item, but it was just a way to say that we can track something, and let's track anything. Just to get in the habit, deliberate practice. So why and what we did, the spikes, DSLs, and code generation is the heart of this, and so we're going to get to next. And I'm sure everybody knows what a spike is. from terms of just running a small experiment, but our goal was to formalize it so that it is, again, deliberate practice, explicit. So from the arbitrary ponderings, we thought formalizing the spike process or making it a process, which also seems silly, which we would like to get away with eventually once everybody starts doing the exercises and they're actually seeing the pattern of behavior reflected on that spike. It's normal again, we'll get rid of it. But right now, we wanted to make sure that we had some kind of formalization. So by creating a systematic approach to spikes, we can make sure that teams are converging on practices, that they are knowing what questions they're trying to answer, that we are putting time boxes to things, that they know when they're done. And also the part of the conflict resolution. So we have two different ways of doing it, fine. Use step-based design, go build both of them, time box it to a week, see what we learn, let's write down some pros and cons, let's bring it back together, and let's move forward as adults, civilized adults, even better. But again, explicit reserved blocks of time, very explicit bounded ideas we're trying to evaluate. So true experimentation, PDCA, all the whole plan, do, check, act stuff. Create a very explicit experiment, define it, and go to attack it. For that to happen, though, boundaries, focus, and dedicated time to do it. We can't make sure that we have to create space for our team members to not just go out and, oh, I had the spike to do, but also I had to solve these 2 bugs, and oh, I'm also on call, and oh, by the end of the sprint, I didn't get to do any of it. One big part of the spike conversation, I mentioned trying to pull forward into proper discovery, and in product-centric organizations, our role in engineering, beyond just technology and solutions, is to also make sure that our product understands the feasibility of these ideas so that we can make sure that what we're about to do is going to work for us, or at least we have more information to be able to go do that. The piece that we will eventually get rid of, we think, will be around this whole explicit documentation for capturing the journey. So I have a sample I'll show in a second, but the goal was making sure that in our standard Jira story, whatever tool you're using to track, making sure that there's standard items in there. So what are the goals and boundaries you're trying to do? What was the rationale for what we're trying to learn? How do we make sure we've captured all those ideas and decisions, and then we can use that as feedback to go on and explore a little deeper. So lines very much up to concepts of standard iteration, model exploration, whirlpool, et cetera. Obviously, it's too small to read, but purpose and rationale, why we're doing these things, tasks and communication, other resources that we need to do, what we learned, did this end up with a dependency on another team, how did we manage that, how could we have known earlier, all those types of items. Just deliberate practice, reinstating to people we have to practice about how we're learning and make sure that we just don't give up halfway through, that it's not very clear, making it very formal. So domain-specific languages. Everyone knows what a domain-specific language is or no? Show of hands. Okay, good, awesome. So similar, we thought there's a handful of these we could apply. DSLs too. Specifically in communication, common communication, creating a place where we can talk about things and move forward. So computer languages, not a general purpose language, built for very specific purposes, very small context, very specific purpose, and our use of DSLs for this particular, as a tool in this particular exercise, was around making sure that we are continuing to talk about the new domains we're learning about. So teams that were before isolated in these very specific sets of applications participated in experiences, and there was complete oblivion to other parts of the experience. So how do we get everybody in the room? What tools do we use? The tool we've been using mostly is event storming, which has turned out to be really well because our business partners really like it. It's active, it gets everybody in, and we get a lot of great information out of it. And we pull that back into our domain model, find out usefulness, and spin it all up again. An example of how we've used this and into the DSLs and our code generation is here. So event storming, Paul's got a session going on right now, and there's more tomorrow. Start off with an event. We've got a customer applied for a card. We have another event that the card account was booked. And finally, an event that says, oh, after we created a new card for someone, we actually created an account for them automatically on the online digital platform. So the commands that would have evoked these events, one is an apply for a credit card, caused this customer apply for card to happen. Once the customer agreed to terms and conditions, then their card account was booked. And then a create card.com account command happened, which resulted in it being created. And once we talk about this with the business partners, we come to the realization that this new accounts context owns these particular pieces, and the digital account space owns these, and then the actors that created them, these were invoked by customers, and this was invoked by a systematic part of the component, it's an account handler. So then we take those and we start to evaluate what are we actually trying to build with these tool sets. So we talk about our event storming. From our event storming, we create our ubiquitous language and we start playing with the domain models. Then we talk about the next piece. Once people start learning the domain, how do we help them navigate the tech space? So if you have been only building web forms forever, how do we start you on, besides hello world, examples of microservices that talk to Kafka or write a hello world message? How do we let them see regular code, simplified, idiomatic language code rather than magic frameworks, how their systems are coming together? So that's the premise. So we started talking about a DSL to decorate context mapping to help us look at how systems interact and how we could start looking and turn that into an automation tool to create services to play with. So one example would be our DSL. We have a customer change consumer that is from our business partners. We have credit context, and there's a line. And when a customer change event from our retail business, when any of them happen, we're simply going to produce to a customer change stream. So the goal is I have a very defined line between my retail business partners and our credit domain space. I want to create a place where any event that happens that changes to a retail version of a customer, I don't care what it is, I'm just going to republish it inside of my system so that we can react to that in the ways we need to. So the goal would be to take this and say, okay, this is some kind of service, and using this consume from would be some, maybe it's a standard ports and dev business would define, create a port that listens to behind the scenes customer change. Take any of those events and publish it internally. Another example would be the example where we talked about creating the digital account. So we have an account creation from new account booked handler. We consume from customer change from our internal stream now. We say, oh, it was an application booked event. Now send a create account command with the contents of that message directly to the card.com account handler. So the idea would be that we see that different language around, well, this is consuming from a stream, and send could be maybe that means we're going to use RPC. And in this case, RPC needs to be coupled with a direct destination because we need to know what it is because it's not just out to the ether, and that's where it would go. So how do we take this kind of language, play with these things? One, it has a purpose in and of itself to help team members understand how the systems are going to interact. So as they start to learn new technologies and things like asynchronous message processing, they can start to see, oh, okay, so this language here is telling me that I need to deal with things that are going to handle from operationally from listening to a message queue. So I go, what do I do if the queue backs up? Right? And just all those fundamental things that we take for granted and helping our team members who've never dealt with them come along. So as we start to talk about them, the ideas start to filter through. So a slightly bigger example. So we just rebuilt the accounts, the credit accounts handling. In this particular domain, it's simplified, but it's bigger than the other one. So we have a credit domain. When we have a new credit account, it interacts with a lot of other contexts. So we have the domain problem space of loyalty. If we have a credit card, it automatically bumps you into a new upper echelon of loyalty for retail. We have our accounts context, which is behind the scenes is a third-party provider of credit card management. We've got our point of sale where we actually take applications. We have a customer history service on the retail side where if you've been a shopper for 10 years and we know a lot about you, it'll get you a better offer on your credit card. And adjudication is the system that takes in all the rules and checks your credit and makes sure that you are creditworthy. So we started talking about how we're building the new system. We continue with our context mapping. we start mapping, oh, we are, point of sale is upstream from us. So we start to do all the relationships with our team. So we're following the mapping exercise. And we get to defining our relationships. And point of sale is a partner with us. They make changes when we need to make changes for us. We make changes for them when they need to. The third-party provider of our credit accounts, they don't care what we do. They're just going to do it anyway. So we're just going to conform to whatever they give us. And we have customer-supplier relationships with our adjudication vendor and then our internal customer history. So we have these relationships, and we want to start looking at how are we going to describe in real interactions, in events, in services, how it's going to play out. So we take another version of a DSL we played with, and we start to define that there's a lot of systems, and maybe the space between needs us to fill it with something. So we start talking about shared libraries, and great, but we have all these different languages. We want to get to 3, but do I have to write contracts for these in 9 languages to make sure that we can move forward? Or what's the path going to be? So we wanted to work on the autonomy of systems, but not require multiple versions of contracts, et cetera. So we defined the space between, and we came up, well, we use schema registry. We'll use the pattern to say, we're just going to define those somewhere else. We'll publish messages back and forth. And any system can just go pull from the registry the type of the version they need and look at what's in there and move forward. But we wanted to make sure it was very explicit. We did another version. It's just a little bit old, and we were going, this example was taken from, let's play with what happens when we take event choreography to its logical extreme, and everything is attempted to be an event even when we have commands. And what did we learn from this? And we learned don't do that. But the goal was we're starting off with a service name, and we're going to have a waits for process credit application command. And when you get that command, either success or failure is going to happen. And when those happen, you're going to get either an application received or an application rejected. We're also playing with the rail pattern, functional pattern of service where that thing comes in and you only get one way out. You get out failure or out success. So let's see how this plays out in what we're trying to learn. So then we do the same thing with our adjudication domain or context. And we do the same thing for loyalty. And we continue on with customer spend history and so on until they're all defined. And this is one set of options. The goal of creating this DSL is to allow us to, in discovery, as we're playing with these ideas and doing the mapping, to quickly create these in multiple ways. Like we want to be able to get to the point where we say, okay, what happens if this is an asynchronous attempt at messaging? Or what happens if this particular call to adjudication is synchronous? Like we need that answer. So what good does it do to be asynchronous and just sit there and wait? Does the application just wait? Well, maybe that's okay, because sometimes if you're at point of sale and you're in line and there's 40 people behind you, you want to move on, but sometimes it's okay because you're at home, and if it's just processing online, no big deal. So the question is, how do we handle timeouts and stuff? But the point being, the process could continue. You've applied for credit. We'll get that credit for you if that vendor happens to be down, and now we would say synchronous, so instead of just waiting and timing out and you don't get it, now we can get a response much later, and when you come back tomorrow, it's waiting for you, the card there. So plays into how we actually want to service the customer. So the general state, we'll come back to this in just a second, but the general state of DSLs for our use, get everyone on the same page, figure out what is different between teams' understanding of different contexts, and improve communication in general. So, code generation piece. How do we take any of that and make it so that we can actually sit down and turn that into something we can play with and learn? Now, at this point, hopefully your teams are learning a lot. And this becomes then sugar on top. So same thoughts, trying to get into, okay, great, we've written a code generator for this particular DSL, and we did it in, we're using Kafka as the streaming platform, but what happens if we stick with SQS or something? How do I swiftly swap out that the port or the adapter implementation on the architecture to get to a new place, port implementation? Infrastructure, we've been playing with infrastructure, can't get anywhere, those problems. So code generation in general, it's fantastic for things that are well understood. So there's a ton of stigma with code generation. I mean, going back to before ORMs were the big thing, and it was just generating DAOs from database tables, all that kind of stuff, to the next big thing becoming Rails, and we'll just build up the scaffolding and be done, to where even one of my mentors built a whole entire ASP.NET Web Forms scaffolding engine just because he wanted to show that it was better than Ruby and Rails, and just the idea that, you don't know how to do it, so you're just going to go generate it, and all the funkiness around that. So like, how do we get beyond that stigma, but how do we also make sure that we can get our team to understand it, but we don't want a ton of frameworks. We don't want them to, there's magic everywhere, and I don't know how this works. I just know I create this thing, and then when it dies, I have no idea how to fix it. So we want to try to create very simple templates using standard architecture and just very simple code to start producing these things. So, so first off, of course, understand your problem. If it's good for things where you need to understand your problem, then you should understand the problem. So in our case, using the DSL, we've been able to say, okay, we're going to stick with, in general, pretty easy ports and adapter style architecture as the root for what we're doing. We can look at that and say, okay, I understand that at this point I have a service that's going to need to have some port defined, and then we can define implementations of that for different technologies, and we can build adapters for that to transfer into, based on the types of the events, et cetera. Of course, you have to understand your technology first. So one of the goals of that core platform team, it has several, and one of those is outreach. So understanding the technology first and being the advocates for the technology across the teams, and rotating through teams and sharing knowledge so that they can deliver that to you. And then this should allow us to experiment with design and then understand your framework. So in our case, things we used for this, we played around with, so most of my teams are on Visual Studio Code, so we're using the NuGet template adapter. So it's, when you want to go create a new project, you have a NuGet template saved up, and it'll generate the template for you for that particular project. We've played with Yeoman to take in some code and run through Yeoman generators to just spit out application project folders. Playing around. And then, of course, you want to take those tools, incorporate it back into, make sure that you are modifying or decorating the DSL in a way that the tools can work. So this is finding out. So we're going to revisit this and go back through. So we said before, what was emerging from understanding our DSL, we have some service definition. We have some language tied to waits for, which is assuming we're going to come back to waiting for a message off some kind of messaging platform. And then we have this sends information. So what we're looking at is, okay, what has come to emerge is that, okay, this thing in the corner, which is, of course, terrible, especially in a DDD talk, CG, so it was defined in the other previous slide about the declarations. But so it's credit gateway is waiting for this command. So we want to talk about, like, now I have this service, and my goal is to generate a bunch of ports and adapters. Then we talk about, okay, what are our ports? So this is going to have some port that is going to define an interface for waiting for some message. And sends is going to have something. So maybe the implementation that we do first is it's just a Kafka producer, like the other example. We're just going to send this out to another stream. Or maybe it is simply calling a RESTful endpoint to drop it off on some other system or queue. But once we have that defined, then we can move forward in our code generation. So how far have we actually made it in doing this? So the generation of service stubs using context map DSL, we don't parse those DSLs. We have a semantic model built on JSON, and I can go in and convert that language into the JSON model. Then that gets pulled into code, and then we can generate stubs. So didn't get to writing a parser for it, but that's the goal of the next steps. We have the ability right now, we have templates defined for .NET Core and Java for autonomous microservices that produce and consume from Kafka. And we have templates that can front-end RESTful endpoints. And other things that we care about, because we're trying to get everybody on the same page, especially across all those systems, some of the more operational cross-cutting concerns. So these templates already have built into them things like our application performance monitoring tool. So if you spin up the template that is a service that's going to get run on Docker, and all of a sudden you run it in the sandbox, metrics are getting delivered to New Relic, metrics are getting delivered to Splunk automatically, and you implement your code. So in all idiomatic language and tool configuration, no other magic. So we can walk through every single template with our team members and review their code in the space where they add their code and start to get that knowledge transfer. So when we started, I probably should have put this before, it was taking us days on days, if not weeks, to get little samples even running. At this point in time, we can get standard services up and running in a few hours. This probably should be updated to even a few minutes at this point. But it still takes us, it's manual to wire a whole system together. We'd like to get to a point where we can generate the full map at one fell swoop. That's where we're at. So bring it all back together. Organizational alignment, proper mindset, practice continuously. The deliberate practice component, I cannot overstate, and how do we get workshops and bringing people along there. And I'm not trying to suggest that we've gotten it perfect. We have a lot of space to go there in terms of making sure everybody comes along, these ideas and the practices there. But it's been key, and it's been the biggest eye-opener for me. How do we get people to get back to a place when they're comfortable experimenting and learning on their own with no thoughts of repercussions? So organizational alignment, obviously everybody doesn't have authority or doesn't have the ability to change how your organization is aligned. Doesn't mean you can't make progress, it just means you need to be aware of the fact. So if you can't change it, just know the limitations around what you can accomplish in terms of Conway's Law and reverse Conway's Law items, and move from there. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
Do we have any questions for Josh? I can bring the microphone around.
Thank you for talk. I have a question about BDD. How would you describe relation between BDD and DSL? Is it the same? Is it different? Should you use it together or?
For BDD?
Yeah, behavior-driven development.
Yeah. I would use BDD as a. So I put on there at some point a note about testing and testing consistency. So we use SpecFlow as our BDD tool, but we define our scenarios in terms of each of the actual business functionality that's there. Oddly enough, though, we did attempt to play with, instead of writing our own DSL, attempt to play with using BDD-style tools, Cucumber, to generate the actual services. But it's completely separate. So BDD is a tool for shaping behavior on a particular feature. It can be used, and then you can, so after you've generated everything, now you've got a feature you want to write, you would build that in tandem with the actual functionality that it would be implemented in each of the, say, the handling of those items or otherwise.
Hi. So I'm just curious if you evolved from the mean time to validated learning. I know you mentioned the cycle time of the service creation. Obviously, it improved dramatically, but that's the stuff that you know how to do.
Yeah.
I know you were trying just to track validated learning. Did you get anywhere?
Our metrics are terrible. Our metrics are terrible. We're all over the place. Hence, the goal is just get to write down something so that we're getting in the habit of tracking so we can start to converge. But it's a piece that is still very weak, I admit.
Any chance that your code generation is open sourced or that you would open source it?
I think so. It's not right now, but where I'm working, we have some goals to start pushing more back to the community. Yeah. Write that down.
Hi. What's the process of actually creating the DSL? Like, you involve your domain experts, or how do you come with those terms and so on?
It emerged from us doing our event storming exercises and just the context mapping. So as we were playing with the ideas and how the systems interacted, we just started to use the same things over and again, and the whiteboard started to have the same terminology. So we just started to work backwards from that into something that would be consistent.
So the question is that you kind of described the journey, but if you have an organization that is looking at this but doesn't have currently the capability, how would you suggest what would be the best way for this organization to go on that path? basically which skills you are looking for from the technical leadership perspective. You mentioned already organization. Yes, I get it. From the technical perspective, how to make it working.
Well, so we started, so the very first set of documents was from about 3 years ago. So this was well before we actually had the authority or power to make these changes. It was when I was a newer employee, it was something we started doing with the team to, I was brand new to everything, and we wanted to see, there was a previous attempt to actually write that system a few years ago, of which I was involved, and it was trying to understand the systems. We came up with the first part of that a few years ago, and it wasn't until recently that we were able to put it in place. So there's always going to be the idea that I am using these tools in a place where I may not have full business buy-in, or this isn't exactly what business represents, because they're not involved. At that time, they weren't involved at all. So it was me learning from people that had been there 20 years of domain, in which case, they've been there, they know it very well. It was accurate, but I got lucky. So if you're in a situation where that's not the case, you throw in caution to the wind, I guess. You'll end up with technical implementation that may or may not meet the need. But if the team understands and knows, it all depends on that level in that organization. I mean, there's.
So would you say that it was mostly guerrilla type of effort first on your side? Guerrilla meaning
Yep.
that it wasn't officially, so to speak, vetted by saying, yes, you can do that. Or you actually had a space, let's say 20% of my time I could spend basically on doing experimentation, including this particular.
At the time, it was relatively hidden. I mean, so it was kind of guerrilla, but it was, we weren't hiding it, we were doing it, but no one understood what we were doing. So there was this, the fog of, I don't understand technology, but I also don't want to know about it. But that's changed drastically. Yeah. Doesn't really answer your question, though.
Yes.
Could you, if you go back 2.5 years ago when you made that decision to try to use the financial services software as opposed to having your own, what it sounded like was you ended up with a domain mismatch between the two different pieces. And I'm just kind of curious, could you have used some of the ideas from DDD to have avoided that mistake?
Yeah, so the goal at the time wasn't that we would necessarily move to their platforms and keep going. The goal was move to their platforms and throw everything we had away, and as well as the teams. So it was a one fell swoop change to another organization's technology, an organization like we were all going to be gone, which is the difference between saying, yes, had we worked with them on their platform to build follow the DD patterns, put anti-corruption layers in place, move over into our system, we absolutely could have. That wasn't the goal either. The goal was to not require, it wasn't our core domain as a retailer, it was to eliminate it. So it just wasn't going to work for that particular case.
I think we got time for one more.
This will be relatively short. So enterprise service bus people tend to do a lot of things like this. And I guess I was just wondering, did you ever look at MuleSoft or something like that where they try to do this rapid prototyping of APIs and things like that?
We have a large footprint ESB team in our organization, and the goal was to get away from that. And again, this goal wasn't to generate this and then throw it in production. This was to use this as learning, and then we started to augment our templates so that they could be used. So like when I talk about the APM and the monitoring, the logging stuff, it became, hey, well, we can still use this as a platform, but the goal is that I'm going to rapidly run through all these different ways of interaction of the system and then throw it away, and then what you get left with could potentially be augmented and set up for product. But we're not anywhere near the ability to take one of these templates and throw it directly into production. Yeah. But we're aware of very similar types of things. So.
Thank you, Josh. Round of applause, please.
Thanks.